Good afternoon, everybody. I am Mary Hunt, co-director of WATER, the Women's Alliance for Theology, Ethics, and Ritual here in Silver Spring, Maryland, on Wednesday, October 19th, 2022. I am here with my colleagues Diane New and Pamela Miller, and we are delighted to welcome you to yet another WATERtalk. And our topic today is a very exciting one to me. It's a talk with Rabbi Toba Spitzer, who has written a book called God is Here, Reimagining the Divine. It's published by St. Martin's in 2022. And we're just thrilled to have Rabbi Spitzer with us, as well as to have an opportunity to hear from her what she thinks this book is about and how she thinks it's having an impact. We welcome all of you, especially those who are new to WATER. We welcome all of you. This is a special welcome to you, Toba, because this is your first time with us and you grace our circle. So I hope you feel a very warm WATER welcome. Let me begin, as we always do, with a land acknowledgement. We at WATER are on Indigenous land in Silver Spring, Maryland. This is the traditional and contemporary land of the Piscataway and the Anacostan people. We acknowledge the trauma and injustice toward Indigenous people that is deep in U.S. culture and deep in U.S. history. We join in efforts to eradicate it and to make reparations for the genocide involved. WATER's work is aimed to bring about social justice. I invite you just to take a moment as we begin this WATER work to consider the Native people on whose land you sit. WATER's work brings together feminist, womanist, spiritual values and intellectual work, and we bring that work together with social change. Feminist, womanist, spiritual values and intellectual work with a focus on social change. We're not doing this just because it's fun, although it's fun, but we're doing it because our world needs it. Last month, we were thrilled to have with us the Reverend Dr. Ofelia Ortega, the former rector of the Protestant Seminary in Matanzas, Cuba. She spoke to us about her book, Cuban Feminist Theology, Visions and Praxis. Those of you who were there, you might wave your hands, will remember it was an amazing event. To be, first of all, having someone come to us from Cuba, given the way the world works, and secondly, to have a woman in her mid-80s who is doing such vital work. As some of you may have heard, our dear Ofelia Ortega was hospitalized literally the night after the night of the session with dengue, which was epidemic in Cuba at the time. And now, even after Hurricane Ian, I can report that she is doing well back home, recovering. So for those of you who were concerned about her, that's the update. But what an event that was. I urge other people to go and watch that on our website at www.waterwomensalliance.org. Let me suggest to those who haven't been here how it is that we go about this work. It's a format that we use, and it seems to make generous use of the hour we set aside to be together. I will make a brief introduction of Rabbi Spitzer. She will speak for 20 to 25 minutes with plenty of time left for dialogue, for questions and answers, for discussion. We invite you to listen and enjoy. The video of this will be up on our website shortly, within the week. We also publish notes that go with our sessions, and those are available for your use as well on the website. So you just relax, enjoy your lunch, take a break, whatever it is. But I invite you to mute your audio, to cut down on noise, and assure that we have a clear line for the presentation. And then when it's time for the comments for discussion, I'll let you know, and then you can in turn open your audio line. This allows us to get a really good audio recording. And I think you'll find that having good audio recordings is really one of the benefits of this. So many people who want to be part of our programs, who can't make it given the hour or situations arise or whatever, do go back and listen to these. And these are also a way in which our speakers get the word out about their work. And I think it's so important that we support one another in all of this. We will finish our work together at 2 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time to respect everyone's schedule. You can re-listen, as I said, or you can read the notes, but you can also stay on for continued conversation on Zoom if you wish to continue the conversation. We never ask our speaker to do that, although they're always welcome, and some do. because we don't want to take more of their time. But for those who'd like to stay on and continue conversation, we end officially at 2, so that those who have to leave can make a graceful exit, and those who want to stay around to chat for a few minutes can do that as well. It's now my pleasure to introduce Rabbi Toba Spitzer, and again, to extend a warm welcome, especially to those who are new to water. We're delighted to have you. Toba Spitzer and I have not had the privilege of meeting in person, but we do have some wonderful common friends. So I look forward to the time when we can do that. I also note, Toba, that you're from Maryland, so perhaps you can picture us on Georgia Avenue in downtown Silver Spring. Let me say something about Rabbi Spitzer. She's a popular teacher of courses in Judaism and economic justice in Reconstructionist Judaism. She has made real contributions, and this book is one of them, to new approaches to thinking about God and the practice of integrating Jewish spiritual and ethical teachings into daily life. I am sure that she, like many rabbis, is getting some rest this week after the recent high holy days, but we're really glad she could fit us into her schedule. She has served as the president of the Reconstructionist Rabbinical Association from 2007 to 2009, and was the first LGBTQ rabbi to head a national rabbinic organization. She's been included in Newsweek's top 50 rabbis in America list and in the 2010 Forward list of 50 female rabbis who are making a difference. So we are delighted to have you. Since she was ordained in 1997, she's been the spiritual leader of a congregation in Newton, Massachusetts. She's been involved for many years in American Jewish efforts to help foster a peaceful resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as well as work in the U.S. for economic and social justice. She serves on several boards and was a founding member of the advisory board of J Street. Rabbi Spitzer has special interest in Jewish approaches to economic justice and the mindful use of money in daily life. Her writings on process theology, Judaism, and social justice, and her work on biblical texts have been published widely. When I blurbed her book at the suggestion of a common friend, I wrote, and I quote my very self, Toba Spitzer is a trustworthy spiritual companion, a rabbi's rabbi. Her teaching spans disciplines and time. She makes spiritual practices concrete and doable, even for amateurs at prayer. Her insights into Hebrew Bible texts stir the souls of believers and non-believers alike. Use this book for personal reflections and expect to be refreshed, renewed, recommitted to a better, more divine here and now. Well, I wrote that as kind of a outsider to the whole scene Catholic theologian. And I talked to a very learned Jewish theologian recently who said, I love that book. And I thought, okay, I didn't go far wrong. So welcome to you, Toba Spitzer. I hope we can call you Toba. I hope you feel at home at Water, where we look forward to your remarks and to a good discussion. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. And thank you once again, if I may, for God is Here. God is Here, Reimagining the Divine. I like to think your title is coming true as we speak. Well,
I hope so. I'm going to drop a link to my website in the chat so that folks who want to check out the book can go do that. Thank you so much for that incredible introduction. I feel like, one of the blessings of this book is bringing me in connection with people I might not have been in connection with. I didn't know of Water, which I can't believe it. All these years, I hadn't heard of Water until we were connected. And Mary, I have to tell this group, Mary was so gracious. The publisher didn't quite give me a heads up on when blurbs needed to be in. And I think 2 weeks before that deadline, I got connected. I really wanted a Christian theologian to blurb the book, and got connected to Mary. And you so graciously read the manuscript in like 10 minutes and then and then wrote this beautiful blurb. So I am profoundly grateful. And I'm glad I can pay it back a little bit by being here. So yeah, I thought I'd talk a little bit about the premise of the book, sort of how I got to writing it, and then just read a little bit and then open it up for questions. So I don't know, I feel like I've been thinking about God for a long time, maybe since I was a teenager or earlier. Actually earlier. And I think the first transformation in my thinking about God was from feminist sources, was, reading The Color Purple in college, and God as She, and the famous purple passage in Color Purple, reading Mary Daly's Beyond God the Father, also in that period of my life in the early 80s. And then in the Jewish realm, Judith Plaskow's Standing Again at Sinai. So it was really through feminism that I was introduced, to the notion that we could, think about God, in Daly's words, beyond God the Father, beyond the male God. And then in the realm of Reconstructionist Judaism, which is the branch of Judaism in which I was trained and serve, the work of Mordecai Kaplan, an early and mid 20th century Jewish thinker who was really influenced by Alfred North Whitehead and spoke about God as process, God as power, really trying to get beyond a supernatural personal conception of the divine. And for a while I was in the realm of process theology, and then I literally I feel like I bumped into at a bookstore, the world of cognitive linguistics, which I'm not an expert in, but I gave myself a education in it, and I knew about the role of metaphor in our thinking, but I didn't really get how profound metaphor is. But I want to tell you sort of what I read in this book that I picked up off a staff picks table at a local bookstore, and how that began this journey towards the book, which was really a 10-year journey of teaching and then writing the book. The author of this book, named James Geary, the book is called I As an Other, The Secret Life of Metaphor and How It Shapes How We See the World, or some incredibly long title, was really talking about the work of cognitive linguistics, which began in the 80s, based on the work of George Lakoff and Mark Johnson, and a realm of linguistics that argues that metaphor is foundational to how we experience and perceive the world. And Gary offers a really useful analogy in his book, in which he uses the analogy of volcanoes. So he says, there's the active volcano, the active metaphor, and that's the metaphor we tend to think about, like a literary metaphor. When we come across it in a poem, like Mary Oliver's, has a line in one of her poems, the dark hug of time. Like, we know that time doesn't actually hug anyone. So we read that and we're like, oh, it's a metaphor. That's lovely. And then Gary talks about, that's like an active metaphor. Then there's a dormant metaphor, a more metaphor that we know it's a metaphor, but we use it sort of second nature without thinking about it. He gives the example of, I'm up a creek without a paddle. Like, I'm not in a creek, but you also know what I mean in our culture when I say that. But then he talks about what he calls extinct metaphor. And this is what Lakoff and Johnson refer to as metaphors we live by. And an extinct metaphor, in his analogy, is a metaphor that we're in that operates in our brains and in our experience that we're not even aware as a metaphor. A very basic example is time is money, or time is a precious resource. This is a metaphor that did not exist before the Industrial Revolution. It still doesn't exist in some cultures. And I think it entered our consciousness as people started getting paid for, according to how much time they worked. And we see it in our language all the time. We spend time, we waste time, we budget time. But this notion that time is a precious resource. This is not a definition of time. Time is not a precious resource. Time is infinite, right? Time is sort of beyond our comprehension even. But once we are functioning within this metaphor of time is a precious resource, it's not just a metaphor. It affects how we experience time. We're in a doctor's office for 2 hours longer than we thought we'd be in the waiting room. We feel like we're wasting time. You can't actually waste time. That's not a thing you can do. That's not a definition. But again, we experience it that way. We experience ourselves budgeting time or spending it wisely. Another example is of a metaphor a very basic metaphor is when we say, like, she's a very warm person. And this is a very basic metaphor that comes from an early infant experience of being held, physically held, and experiencing emotional warmth physical warmth as emotional connection. So Lakoff and Johnson started noticing this in our speech, the way we use metaphors all the time. And then later in the 1990s, neuroscience was able to look in our brains and see that actual connections were being made between physical experiences and mental processes. So, they looked in people's brains when they talked about kicking a habit. And actually the part of the brain that activates when you physically kick something is activated when you use that phrase. The connection part of the brain that registers physical warmth connects to the parts of the brain that register emotional closeness. So metaphor is more than just a literary conceit. It's really, it's how we experience the world. And what I realized in reading the Geary book, this book called I As an Other, is oh, God is an extinct metaphor. All the debates that have happened, certainly in the West, over the last 2,000 years about God. Does God exist? Does God not exist? Does God, will this? What does God do about evil? All these questions were really a debate about a metaphor. And the metaphor is God is a very big, powerful person. And even for all the atheists out there, if you don't believe in God, that's the God you don't believe in, right? And again, I'm certainly far from the first person to point this out. Feminists have been pointing it out for a long time. But what I realized was, what this insight did for me was the goal is not to come up with a different definition of God, which I had been sort of working on in process theology. The challenge is just to come up with other metaphors or to reclaim other metaphors that already exist. And from my, speaking for myself, in Jewish tradition, much of which is shared with Christian tradition. Because metaphors are not definitions. Sometimes maybe it's nice to think of God as a father if you had a nice father, right? It's nothing bad with that metaphor, but it's one metaphor. And what Lakoff and Johnson point out is that when it comes to complex human experiences, when we talk about life, when we talk about love, when we talk about time, when we talk about emotions, we need more than one metaphor. Because when you shift metaphor, you shift your experience of that thing. So whatever the divine is, whatever the realm of the sacred is, and I believe it's a foundational human experience, how we relate to the universe, part of that is experiencing the sacred, we need lots of metaphors to get at that. So we need multiple metaphors. We cannot get at complex, abstract human experience without metaphor. Metaphors have the power to shape our reality. And really importantly, what's at issue with a metaphor is not whether it's true or false. Metaphors are not true or false. They shape our thought and our action. So the question is, what happens when I'm relating to something through a particular metaphor? When I experience time as a limited resource or time as money, I experience time in one way. When I experience time as a flow, I experience it in a very different way. I would say the same thing is true for God. The last thing I'll say about metaphor, and then I want to read a little bit from the book, is that metaphor is always grounded in our embodied experience. When we're trying to get at an experience that is by nature somewhat abstract, the metaphor we use is always embodied. And in my book, I went back to the sources of my tradition. I went back to the Hebrew Bible and to rabbinic text, and found that in fact the Hebrew Bible, which is also foundational for the Christian Bible, is filled with embodied, mostly earth-connected metaphors for the divine. And the way the book works is in the first 2 chapters basically cover everything I just said in a little bit more depth, and sort of how we got to the God as a big person or God as a distant emperor metaphor. And then all the chapters after that lift up different metaphors, again, primarily from Jewish tradition, mostly from the Hebrew Bible. God as water, God as makom, place, which is a rabbinic metaphor. God as voice, as sound. God as rock. God as cloud. God as fire. God as becoming, I will be that I will be. And then the final chapter is some modern metaphors. So that's how the book works. And then in each chapter, I have practices. Because what I realized was these aren't metaphors to be read and thought about. These are metaphors to be re-experienced, and we need to bring them back to life. So in every chapter, I offer practices that try to re-enliven and re-engage us with the metaphor. So with your permission, I will do a little reading from the book. I wanted to start with water, since that's the name of this group, and then try to read it from a couple chapters, and then I'd love to hear if you have thoughts or reflections, Mary, and then we'll open it up. So this is from a chapter called Drinking from God. The year that he turned 40, my father suffered a massive heart attack. I remember coming home from school that afternoon, I was in 11th grade at the time, and being told by my mother what had happened. It was a total shock. My father was young, strong, seemingly healthy. Heart attacks were things that happened on TV or in the movies, not to me or the people I loved. Thankfully, my father survived. He spent over a month in the hospital and came home a different person than the man who went in. After decades of smoking 1 to 3 packs of cigarettes a day, he became a virulent non-smoker. After years of working long hours and subsisting largely on coffee and cigarettes, he pulled way back on the work hours and watched his diet carefully. Beginning a few months after he got home from the hospital, my father would drive out to the Calvert Cliffs in Maryland, almost an hour from our house, to walk along the beach and collect shark's teeth and other fossils. He would spend hours there, methodically searching the sand at the base of the cliffs. Wading through water by the shore, he developed an incredible patience, able to see shark's teeth lying in the sand that to me were invisible. Around the same time, my father took up kayaking. This was the late 1970s and early 80s, before paddling became a popular leisure time activity. To learn how to navigate in whitewater, my dad took a week-long course in North Carolina. He would practice rolling his kayak at the local pool. But even though he ended up joining a boat club where Olympic kayakers trained, he wasn't trying to become competitive. He simply loved being out on the Potomac River, whether paddling through flat water or floating down the rapids. I do not think it was entirely coincidental that water-related activities became my father's de facto spiritual practice after his near-death experience. Water is a powerful force of nature, and many people are drawn to spend time by the ocean or by lakes and streams. We owe our very lives to the availability of water. Indeed, the majority of ourselves are largely made up of water. In many cultures, water is a symbol of life and power. It is therefore not so surprising that water is one of the most prevalent metaphors for God in the Hebrew Bible. So I'm going to just jump ahead a few pages. I grew up in Maryland, where access to water was never an issue. There was plenty of rain year-round, and so much humidity in the summer you could practically drink the air. Then at the age of 18, I went to spend a year in Israel, living on a kibbutz in the Negev desert. Suddenly, water was a precious resource. Rain only fell in the winter months, and in the orchards where I worked, the trees were sustained by miles of drip irrigation tubes. It was hot but dry in the summer, and we Americans had to be constantly reminded to drink. I remember our first hike in the desert, stopping to take a drink from my canteen. I didn't even realize until the water hit my mouth how incredibly thirsty I was. It is hard to express how deeply satisfying that canteen of lukewarm water was in that moment. That experience comes to mind as I read biblical passages where the author speaks of thirsting for God and drinking from a godly well or stream. And these are verses from Psalms. How precious is your love, O God! Humanity is nourished from the riches of your house. You give them drink from the stream of your delight. Elohim, you are my God. I seek you. My soul thirsts for you. My flesh faints for you, as in a dry and weary land where there is no water. As the deer longs for water streams, so does my soul long for you, O God. When I think of my father walking along the water's edge by the Calvert Cliffs or paddling on the Potomac, I wonder if his soul was drinking in some kind of spiritual sustenance, even as his physical self was enjoying the literal waters. I know that this metaphor of a thirsty soul resonates with me. It is an accurate description of those times when I feel spiritually dry, as if some essential source of nourishment has been cut off. In those moments, I am like that deer in the Judean desert, searching for an afik, a channel in the earth that fills when it rains. At these times, God is the source from which my thirsty soul can be quenched, if only I am willing to drink. In the words of the prophet Isaiah, I can be like that orchard in the Negev, nourished by godly waters. Quote, Adonai shall guide you always and satisfy your soul in drought, and you shall be like a watered garden. So one thing I found when I started working on the book was, so again, water was all over mostly Psalms and prophets as a metaphor for the divine. And we know these texts, if you know Hebrew Bible at all, these are familiar texts. And all I really did was started taking them seriously. Like, I think our ancestors really experienced God this way. And then I discovered what I call water names for the divine. Peleg Elohim, the river of God. Nachal Adonecha, the river of your delight. Makor Mayim Chaim from Jeremiah, the fount of living waters. And I realized, what if we just took these metaphors seriously and really started to engage with them, not as just nice literature, but as actual ways to experience the divine. So it was sort of my process, and I did the same thing with cloud and with rock and with fire. And I'm just going to share one more section, and then we'll open it up. So I also wanted to think about some modern metaphors, and I want to read to you from the last chapter, which is God as electricity. So A few years into my rabbinate, I was on a retreat with about 30 other rabbis from across the Jewish denominations. On the opening night, we did a get-to-know-you exercise in which we had a series of 3-minute conversations with one another, each with a different prompt. As I moved around the circle of colleagues, I prepared to answer the question, if you hadn't become a rabbi, and money or ability or prerequisite knowledge was not an issue, what would you have been? I was pretty sure I was going to say I'd have been a community organizer. I had worked in a variety of progressive organizations before going to rabbinical school, and I identified as a social justice activist. So imagine my surprise when it was my turn to answer the question, and what came out of my mouth was, I would have been a physicist. The reason I found this completely surprising is that I am terrible at math and never got anywhere near a physics class in my high school or college years. There was no one less likely to have become a physicist than I. But after I gave my answer, I realized that I do share something with those who are blessed to do physics, a sense of wonder at the universe and a deep desire to understand how things work. As a rabbi, I get to engage in big questions, and I seek to discern some kind of meaningful order in what often feels like a disordered, chaotic world. I want to know what makes us tick and what the larger context is for human existence. And while I can't really fathom what physicists do, I wonder if some of the same desires and curiosities are at play. When I read the Hebrew Bible, I imagine that its authors were sort of like me and sort of like modern physicists, seeking answers to how the cosmos works and what our place in it is. Their experience of the divine was part of that exploration, was in fact inseparable from it. Science offers metaphors that help me understand some of the more challenging aspects of the biblical portrayal of God. Among the most difficult stories in the Bible are those in which seemingly unsuspecting characters get zapped by God. A good example is the story of Nadav and Avihu. Aaron's oldest sons make an unauthorized offering at the altar and are immediately consumed by the divine fire. Something similar happens in the book of Samuel, when King David attempts to bring the Ark of the Covenant, a golden box holding the stone tablets that Moses received on Mount Sinai, to his capital city of Jerusalem. The Ark is being transported on an ox cart, and when the oxen stumble, one of the men guiding the cart, a guy named Uzzah, reaches out to steady the Ark. When he touches it, God is incensed and strikes him down, and Uzzah dies. This story seems even worse than the episode with Nadav and Avihu. They at least could be accused of making a dubious offering in an irresponsible way. All that poor Uzzah did was try to keep the Holy Ark from falling out of a cart. Why in the world would God strike him down? Earlier in the Bible, the Israelites are warned that only the tribe of the Levites are authorized to transport the various items of the Mishkan, the Holy Tabernacle. And the men responsible for transporting the ark, via a set of poles fastened to rings on its sides, have to be extremely careful not to actually touch it or they will die. When God strikes Uzzah in the story of the ox cart, it seems to be the unavoidable consequence of someone touching a holy object that is profoundly dangerous to humans. The best that I can understand how the ancient Israelites understood this holy danger is through the metaphor of electricity. The Holy of Holies at the center of the Mishkan housed the Ark, which functioned something like the core of a nuclear reactor, supplying the sacred energy that was then channeled by the priests through their rituals. Just as enormous precautions have to be taken to safely make use of nuclear energy, so too did those who interacted with the Mishkan and the Ark at its center have to take extreme care not to get zapped. When the book of Samuel describes God being incensed when Uzzah touches the Ark, we can understand it less as the emotion of anger and more like a natural physical reaction. It's akin to me being able to safely use the electrical power that is supplied to my home as long as it is wired and grounded properly. I need to avoid sticking my finger in the socket. Hapless Uzzah had the best of intentions, but by touching the ark, he did the biblical equivalent of holding up a metal rod in a lightning storm and got a shock that took his life. The question remains, why did the authors of the Bible perceive godly power as so inherently dangerous? What truth were they trying to convey in these metaphors of fire and electricity and the stories of zapping that happens to people both innocent and guilty? My answer is that the biblical authors were acknowledging a simple reality. To be alive is pretty damn scary. We exist in a universe that is largely, even today, beyond our understanding. We are often at the mercy of forces we cannot control. The ancients were very honest about God, and the Bible is not a Hallmark greeting card. It is a holy, sometimes contradictory muddle of beauty and horror, love and pain, hope and hopelessness, a lot like life. And somewhere within and beyond all of this complexity is Yud He Vav He, the source of life itself. As the prophet Isaiah audaciously declared, forming light and creating darkness, making peace and creating destruction, I, Yud He Vav He, do all these things. There is only one power source of the universe, the prophet teaches. It manifests in that which we find pleasant and in that which scares us. It both sustains us and makes us mortal. And just as with electrical current, if we don't properly channel that divine power, we can generate some severe shocks. As the world witnessed in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, when human beings start playing with the primal energies of the universe, we take on godlike powers of both creation and destruction. Perhaps the Bible was right in warning us that there are some things that we humans should just not touch. So I think I'll pause there. So that was just a little taste of the book and two very different metaphors. Yeah, I'll open it up. Mary, anything you want to reflect on? And then I'd love to hear people's thoughts, questions, challenges.
Thank you so very much, Toba. This was a tour de force through a book that I think many people will want to read. God is Here. And maybe we shouldn't be. I think your final comments, maybe we shouldn't be trying to find our way into such circles. Great things to think about. Very provocative. I just have one comment first, and that is to say, I think you're absolutely on the money that physics and not philosophy is the handmaiden of theology. That's the language set in the field, is that philosophy is the handmaiden of theology. Well, I think it's physics, and I've said that for years. I think you're absolutely right. The other thing I want to just comment on is I was thinking about you as a rabbi, and I was thinking about coming off the High Holy Days. What are the issues that some of your congregants might have raised during the Holy Days? What are they concerned about, and how did your work in this volume, how did your work on language about the divine help them in some concrete ways? And the reason I ask that is because in the Christian tradition, it is my observation, and I can be corrected, but it's my observation that issues around inclusive language and expansive language have been perhaps broad but not deep, and they have not had much impact. And that means that if you go to a Lutheran church or a Methodist church, or I won't even mention a Catholic church, so no competition, there's just no inclusive, much less expansive language about the divine. And I ask that because I think that you're pointing to something that's terribly important, and it's something that we all need to be learning about. So if you could say something about that, I would be helpful.
Yeah, it's complicated, the relationship of sort of God language and prayer language. So we have a particular challenge in Judaism. Well, it's sometimes a challenge, sometimes makes it life easier. Our liturgy is in Hebrew. Most of my congregants do not speak Hebrew. So, and then there's an English translation. The English translation and we have this other very interesting thing in Jewish tradition that you don't have in Christianity, which is that we have this name of God. You heard me speak it a few different ways when I just read. I represent it by YHVH in the book, but it's the holiest name of the divine that we don't say aloud. It's the letter, Hebrew letters Yud He Vav He. At some point got translated Jehovah. It's not Jehovah. There's no J sound in Hebrew. And our tradition is that you don't try to say it. It's actually not sayable because those are all soft letters that make no sound without a vowel. So it's probably, if it's any sound, it's like, that's probably the sound of it. It's like breath. What's great about it is that I think it was the equivalent of the second commandment in our listing of commandments. The second commandment is you shall make no physical representation of the divine. This is like the linguistic parallel of that. You can't even say the name of the divine, which I think says don't limit your thinking about God. The problem is at some point in English translation, it started getting written as the Lord. And I think King James, it's the Lord whenever that name comes up. And that got transposed into English translations of the prayer book. So people, that's name that's unsayable, and that is like the most ineffable name we have became the Lord, which is like the most, human male metaphor there could be. Luckily, our prayer book in the English puts a lot of different ways of conceptualizing the divine in the translation. So that's one way that our prayer book helps with that. That being said, there are parts of the High Holiday liturgy, especially, and I spoke about this actually this past High Holidays, that very much reify a sort of human, especially male, image of the God. God as judge, God as shepherd, which is not a bad image. No, again, these aren't bad necessarily, but they tend to reinforce that sort of person notion of God. So what I've tried to do over the years is put things out for people to read, to speak about it. But we haven't gone far enough, I think, in our own liturgy and services, and I want to think more about that. What I have done is teach this material, and I think it's hard to, that's maybe the challenge, Mary, is that in any one service, it's very hard, because if you use the word God, people immediately go to the metaphor they're in, which is usually God as a big person, again, even if they don't like that. What I have found in teaching is that it takes multiple sessions, and it takes, really engaging with these metaphors. That's really why I wrote the book, and doing the practices to get beyond that. So I don't have the answer liturgically. In one thing I do in our services is, when we get to our central prayer, the Shema, which is from Deuteronomy 6, where we say, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. When we say, listen, Israel, Yud He Vav He, that name, that unsayable name, our God, Yud He Vav He is one, I invite people to put whatever name they want in there. And it could be one of these names. It could be, we have many names in Judaism, and it could be English, it could be Hebrew, but really just empowering people to use different names. So that's one way I deal with it liturgically. But this year I was reclaiming Avinu Malkeinu. I was reclaiming our Father, our King, which is a central metaphor, and trying to unpack what that meant. I think the last thing to say about that is that, and this is a question more about liturgy than about God as metaphor, but what I try to remind my folks is that the prayer book is not a book that this is the problem. In America, in modern America, when we pick up a book, the first question we ask is this fact, or is it fiction, or is it nonfiction? And I try to say to people, a prayer book is neither fiction or nonfiction, it's poetry. And when I open a book of poetry, I don't ask, do I believe this? When I open a book of poetry, I ask, where is this trying to take me? And that's what liturgy is. Liturgy is poetry, and it's trying to take us somewhere. So that's my invitation to people with any kind of liturgy, is where is this trying to take me? And I love our liturgy for that. It's trying to take us to a place of awe, a place of praise, a place of wonder, a place of confronting our own mortality, all kinds of places that we may or may not want to go. But it's neither fact nor fiction. And I think that's really the challenge when it comes to liturgy.
Great. Well, we have, as you know from our name, the Women's Alliance for Theology, Ethics, and Ritual. We have a lot of liturgy people here, starting with Diane New, and I'm sure they're all ears. So now they're going to be all hands raised. I'm inviting you now, folks, to continue this conversation. Use the Zoom reaction button on the bottom right of your screen where it says reactions, and then just raise your hand as I am doing. And then when you finish, you can lower your hand, and we'll hear your questions, your comments, some things that you'd like Rabbi Spitzer to talk more about. So let me open the floor. I see two people immediately, and I will recognize you in the order in which you are appearing on my screen. And please be brief if you can, because we've got lots of people and we want to hear lots of questions. So, and it might help Toba to have a sense of who you are, or where you are, just in a very synthetic way. And I'll start by saying that Sheila Curran is a Sister of Mercy from Dublin, Ireland, who works with immigrants, and she's first. Save you the time, Sheila.
Nice to meet you, Sheila.
Nice to meet you too, and everybody on these Zooms as always. Your presentation was really transformative. It's beautiful, and I love what you've done with metaphor. What I do think it helps in the ecofeminist world and with Indigenous people, that the opening up of metaphors that they have and had for God, in the way that we murdered them for having it, both through the colonization of Christianity and in terms of what the imperialist English language does to other ways in which it closes off the metaphors. And when you were saying about Hebrew, I think that's one of the things that when you're saying there's words you can't even find that have, that English doesn't give that expansiveness to. But I think it's really a beautiful way in which that interconnectedness with both earth, indigenous groups of people, but their ways of seeing those expressions are so real that can help bridge and open us all into a more creative and more use in the way we do both liturgy, but also in the way we live out who the divine is in the world today. And I think that is really powerful. So thank you.
Thank you, Sheila. And I think, and that's really what was sort of when I started diving into, Hebrew Bible, especially, right? The Hebrew Bible was written by people on a particular land, in the land of Israel, and they related to that land. And yeah, and I think, and it's not, we don't, and I think, there's always that tricky relationship of non-Indigenous people to Indigenous culture. And I know, I think people are getting more wise about that, but misusing and trying to take other people's rituals and all. And I think for those of us in the Jewish and Christian traditions, we can go back. We have our own roots. Like we have this in our tradition. We don't need to be appropriating Indigenous traditions that aren't ours. We can say that, our ancestors experienced God as rock, as water, as fire, in very authentic ways. And I think that's really, to me, that's been really a gift. Erica.
Hi, Rabbi. My name is Erica, and I am Mennonite. I'm a pastor. I'm also a member of a Reformed shul with my wife, who's Jewish. Soon she'll be bat mitzvahed. We're very excited.
Oh.
Yeah. Just thinking about metaphor, which really connects with my sense of processing the world and spirituality. Are there any wrong metaphors for God?
That's a really good question. I think we have to think about what are the implications of a metaphor. So, for example, there's a book I cite a bit in the book, which I love. It's a wonderful book if folks aren't in, James Kugel's The God of Old, where he's a Bible scholar, Jewish Bible scholar, who in this book really, it's the most personal book, I think, and he really tries to get at the earliest strands of the Hebrew Bible and how people were experiencing the divine, and it's just very powerful book. But he talks about sort of after the destruction of the first temple and the dispersion of the 10 northern tribes, and how God became sort of a distant emperor, and the distant emperor metaphor of the divine. I don't know if it's inherently bad, but I think what happens is there's one, and I really learned this from process theology, when our only metaphor for the divine is God is a distant emperor, and the only metaphor we have for divine power is coercive power, meaning the power to make us do things against our will. That is problematic. I would say that's problematic because we then tyrannical power becomes godly, and that's problematic. So yes, I do think we have to ask the implications of a metaphor. So that's number one. The other is some metaphors work in certain situations and some metaphors don't. And I think that's the other. So again, sometimes human metaphors for the divine are beautiful, God as parent or beloved or sister or brother, like those are beautiful. But they don't work in every situation. And the whole realm of theodicy, the whole realm of evil is real. I find the human metaphors really don't work, because then we're really stuck with, why is God doing this to me or us? Why doesn't God stop this from happening? And there's part of the book where I talk about my spouse passed away from cancer, and I was really deep in writing. I was really in the midst of writing the water chapter at the time, and was doing a chant composed by my colleague and teacher, Rabbi Shefa Gold, for a verse from Isaiah. When you pass through the waters, I am with you. I won't let the rivers overwhelm you. That's the verse. And I was chanting it, and Gina was chanting it with me. And I was like, all right, God is the water. So God is reality. God is the water. When you pass through the waters, I am with you. I won't let the rivers overwhelm you. So the divine is part of this terrible experience, because it's part of reality that we get sick and die, even when we really with all our heart wish it wasn't happening. And this verse is telling me there's something in the water that supports me and won't overwhelm me. And then I realized, and so the question became not, why is this happening to me, or why is this happening to her? The question became, or, why is God doing this to me? The question became, how do I navigate this? That's a really useful question. Why is God doing this to me? Which is you only ask that if God is a human. That's really you don't ask that of rocks. We don't say to rocks, why are you doing this to me? We don't say to the ocean, why are you doing this to me? Right? You only ask that question if you're in the God as a human metaphor, even again, if you're in it completely unconsciously. Why is God doing this to me is sort of a useless question. How do I navigate this is a profoundly useful question. So I think there are metaphors that might have problematic implications, and I think we have to ask what a metaphor helps us uncover. I was working on the chapter of God as fire in the summer of 2020 in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, and as cities were burning up. And it really was an amazing opportunity to wrestle with anger and holy anger. And what is holy anger? And what is that aspect of the divine in the Hebrew Bible that, unfortunately, and I have to a little bit blame Christian tradition, not entirely, for sort of the angry Old Testament God, which comes out of a lot of those texts, where if we go into the metaphor of fire and we don't think of God as a big person, all of a sudden the fire doesn't mean God is not an angry old man. God is a both transformative and destructive power, and it became very, very fruitful. So that's what happens when we shift metaphor. I think it gives us access to things in different ways. So I don't know if that answers your question. Good. All right. Thank you. Mary, yes.
Yeah, terrific question and a really important answer. Mary Jelinek is next.
Hi, Rabbi Toba. I really have gotten so much out of this presentation today. Thank you so much. I work at the United Nations, and I work with a lot of young people, indigenous people, and people from other religions. My religious tradition is Catholicism, but I don't have the language really to speak sometimes with other traditions because my own religious language is too limiting. And what you've said today really gives me new avenues in my mind of how to deal with younger people working on climate change, how to deal with people in our own delegation who are Jewish, who don't adhere to the traditional Jewish language. And certainly as a Christian, we have a lot of conversations with Muslim groups too, who speak very poetically. And I've always found a dearth in my own tradition to respond in kind, but you've given me a lot of new tools and really a lot of vision here. Thank you. Thank you very much.
That's wonderful. And all the Christian colleagues on the call here, I'm pretty well connected in the Jewish world. I'm not as well connected in the Christian world. So I appreciate any help you have in getting this out there. I put a link to my website up, but I have a couple webinars. I'll offer it again, but I also recorded a couple webinars, hour-long webinars on how to teach this. So if you are clergy or if you're a Christian educator or in another tradition, and I have heard from Muslim folks who also like the book, I wrote it because I was teaching it for 10 years. I was preaching it, and it was, people were telling me it was changing their lives. And I was not a person that ever thought she had to write a book. Like it wasn't like a life goal, a bucket list thing. I wrote it because I felt like this was really important, and it felt like something that was coming through me. I feel like I'm bringing things together. None of this feels original to me. I have to be honest. I feel like I educated myself in cognitive linguistics just enough to be somewhat coherent about it, I think. And then I dived into the sources that I knew. And so what I'm trying to do is just get the word out. And so I appreciate Water for giving me this, opportunity. But like I said, I do think it's useful in the Christian world and other places besides the Jewish community. So I appreciate folks who are appreciating it. And please get it out there. It is, I think, an opportunity for people to reconnect, hopefully, to their own tradition in new or different ways.
Thank you. Thanks, Mary Jelinek. Helpful question, helpful comment, really helpful reflection on what's happening here. I wanted to ask another question, and that is, I loved that you quoted Bernice Johnson Reagan about the singing being more important than the song. Some of you know Bernice Johnson Reagan from Sweet Honey in the Rock. And I wondered, in other words, that the doing of it was more important than the thing itself. So perhaps the loving is more important than the loved one, or the cooking is more important than the food. Though in none of these cases is the object trivial. You don't want a bad lover and you don't want lousy food. I'm wondering if you could, or bad music, I suppose. Can you say some more about the insight about where it goes and where it stops, where and what, because there is a point at which, you do want a good lover and good food and good music. So I love the insight, but I want to take it some new place as well. Any thoughts on that?
So interesting. So just for folks who haven't read the book, Mary's referencing the chapter on God as kol. It's a Hebrew word kol, K-O-L, kuf vav lamed, that is translated as sound or as voice. I really, my first insights into this came from a wonderful book by Val Webb. I mean, I don't know if you've ever had her speak, but she has a wonderful book about metaphor also. I believe she's in the Christian tradition. And I think I quoted the Bernice Johnson Reagan in the context of thinking about God as sound or voice on a really a physical level, as vibration. And I think in that little quote, which was from a wonderful interview that Bernice did with Bill Moyers in the 90s, about sort of what happens on the body level. So it's about the doing of it, Mary, but I think it was also in that particular case about, it's really, I mean, like what's transformative about this? You know, I think each of the metaphors speaks to a different experience, and I think the sound one was about how there's something transformative that happens, and she talks about in the Black church tradition, the singing is supposed to change you, like something is supposed to change you, and I think that's how I understood that. So there is, you know, and I saw someone put, I mentioned Shefa Gold, and someone here posted right here. So Shefa has created a Jewish chant tradition that's based in the Sufi tradition of zikr. And there are words and there are tunes, but she says it's really the physical practice of chanting. After 20 minutes, something happens in your brain. So these are physical. So again, we're really coming back to the body. It's really coming back to the body, I think. And you mentioned, you know, sex and food and all that. It's like what happens in our bodies that's transformative. So I think that's maybe the point here. And I think God is fire as well as another metaphor. It's really about transformation, it's about destruction and then creation. So again, a lot of the practices in the book bring us back into the body and re-experiencing, because that's how we experience the world. We're embodied creatures. We're carbon-based life forms. So I really emphasize that this book is to be like, please don't just read it. Like, do the practices. You know, it's really important. And the doing. So that's where I think the doing is important. We have to experience it. The experience is important. So it's not God as noun or God as verb. It's just that in the doing, we then have the experience. And for me, the metaphor angle reframed the questions into one of experience. And that's where I think this takes us is into an experiential realm, which is why, right, you have theology and ritual in your title. You have to have both, and you can't have one without the other. They influence each other.
And they bookend ethics. So in our case, bookend ethics.
Right. And ethics is also embodied, right? It's how we treat one another and the world, and you know, and the planet. Yeah.
Well, thank you. I found that very helpful and very insightful. Anybody else have a comment or question they'd like to raise or reflection they'd like to offer before we close up shop here? Yes, Janet Bourne, go ahead. Just unmute yourself.
Very quickly, who is the publisher of the book?
It's St. Martin's Press. They have a spirituality imprint, Essentials. So and St. Martin's is now part of Macmillan. So I'm going to drop the link once more. If you go to my website, I just created a website. It's really for the book. It's about the book, not about me. You can do a few things there. You can read more about the book. You can get links to where you can purchase it. There's a link if you're teaching it somewhere that you can purchase it in bulk, which is $25, and then it drops down to. And you can also contact me through there. So if you'd like me to come speak to a different group or help you think about a class, I'm more than happy to do that. So if you go to the website. Pamela.
It's also, it's also on the list of books that Water has promoted, I think, if you go back a month or two. And then Pamela Miller, our own, has a question or comment. Pamela, please go ahead.
Yes, it's a comment. Thank you, Rabbi, for your book. And thank you, Mary and Dan, for this forum. For thousands of years, women's voice have been silenced. We've learned about God through the eyes of men telling their story and patriarchal story. And it's good and refreshing to see women now stepping out the shadow and looking back at people like Esther and Miriam and Deborah and all the other women who were there. The two Abrams, Jacob's granddaughters who were going to be left out because the son, he didn't have any son, and they spoke up and they got their portion. And even talking about God as this angry, dictatorial person, if we read scripture, even in the way it's told, we can pick up that that's not the true story, because he would come down in the cool of the evening to commune with man. That would be somebody who was dictatorial. He spoke with Abraham to say, go somewhere. And he's that kind of God who is gentle, who is like a parent or a friend who a shoulder for you to lean on. So thank you for this book, and thanks for the work that's been done.
Thank you, Pamela. I appreciate it. Yeah. There's so many. I mean, that's really was my hope, was just to. There's so many ways that the divine is described, in the Bible, and and unfortunately, it's right. Sometimes I think actually the ancients. I think we project back on the ancients often. I think they were wiser than us. I think they had more direct experiences of the divine than most of us are privileged to have. And there's a lot, and we don't know who wrote all these texts. We don't know if men or women or non-binary people wrote the Psalms, for example. So I think there's a lot of human experience in there that we the Bible is written over hundreds of years by hundreds of people, and I think it's a beautiful collection of a multiplicity of experiences.
Thank you, and thanks to Pamela, who is like many water connected people, is currently studying in seminary, and will bring these insights into her, I'm confident, into her own ministry, into her own preaching and teaching. So that's why we have these programs, and I'm just delighted that you're all able to be with us today. We are approaching the top of the hour, and it is my unhappy duty to have to close us out at that point, but with great joy that we have had this experience together, and to say that we will leave the Zoom open for continued conversation for those who wish. The audio recording of this session will be on our website, as I said, in about a week, www.waterwomensalliance.org, along with notes. And it will come to you with our deep thanks to Rabbi Toba Spitzer for her book, God is Here. And it's a wonderful synthetic title, Reimagining the Divine, but it's so much more. And I urge you to order it, to get it for your congregational library or your institutional library, as well as your own. And I encourage you to do the exercises, as Toba mentioned. They're really, in some ways, the richest part of this, because it's not like saying this is the new answer. It's like saying this is a way we get at some of the new questions. And I found that very helpful. Moving along in terms of water programs, I'd like to just report that we will have on Wednesday, November the 9th, the next session of this group with the wonderful Professor Kwak Pui Lan, who will be talking about her book, Postcolonial Politics and Theology. And if you've heard Kwak Pui Lan before, she's at Emory University, you can be sure that this will be a very rich experience. And the book is another great resource for your collection. We will also have in November, on Monday the 14th, Pamela Miller, who just spoke, will be handling our water meditation on the theme of rest, R-E-S-T, and don't we all need it? And that will be at 7:30 in the evening. All water programs, of course, are open to everyone. And then on Tuesday, the 15th, Diane New, also with us, will be offering another water liturgy. There was one last night on Mother Theodore Guerin, which I understand was quite a popular event. So please feel free to join us. All of water programs are free and open to everyone. Of course, your donations to water are needed and welcomed. We try to socialize resources so that those who can donate do donate. Those who cannot, fine as well. Programs are offered to everyone without charge and with great welcome. We believe that if we share together, there's enough. I repeat, if we share together, there's enough. And pushing 40 years of this work, I am happy to say that that seems to be the case, that if we share together, there's enough. So thank you to those who participated today. Special thank you to Toba Spitzer. And enjoy the rest of your day. Be well, be safe, be alert, be aware. There's a lot of stuff happening out there that we need to bring our good energies to. So wonderful water program. Toba, thank you, really.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you, Water, all the folks at Water, for making this happen. I'm going to have to go, but really nice to meet folks even briefly over Zoom. And again, be in touch through my website if you want to follow up on any conversations.
We'll see you again.